One of the end things that we're going to have a look at doing is adding a vignette to our animation, and I'm going to turn on the official video that we're trying to emulate here, and if we scrub through that, we're going to see we start off with a complete black screen, and then gradually our glow sort of expands out and out. We can start seeing some of the clouds and particles and stuff, and then we end up with our complete logo. Now to do this, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use layer styles yet again. So this is the same thing we use for creating the particles and even some of the glow effects that we use for the Doritos text. So I'm going to go right to the top of my layers here, and because that's where I want to have my vignette at this point, and make sure I move my timeline scrubber to the beginning and create a new layer. I'm also going to reduce the size of that, and let's rename this vignette. You may wish to give it a color as well. I'm going to right click, I'm going to make this one green just so it's easy to find. I'm going to fill it with a color, so I'm going to use the paint bucket, and it doesn't really matter what color you use, but I'm just going to fill that. It is important to remember that this is just a big rectangle, it's a shape. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the FX button and go to Gradient Overlay, and by default it should be set to normal. You should be able to have see something similar to that, and you should be able to click on the gradient and go through and select your gradient colors. Now I'm just going to go for a straight black to white here. You should be able to find that, or even create your own. And I'm going to switch this to reverse because I don't want it to be black to white in the center. I want to go from the center being white to black, and the style that I've selected is radial. So if you've got it on linear rather than having it linear, we want it radial, and there we have it. So normal, gradient, and you'll notice here that we've got a scale option, and this is kind of how we're going to animate this. So I'm going to get this close to where I think the finished product would be. So let's say about 96%. If this is off center, you can hit OK, jump out of there, then go back in here, and then you can actually move that around and try and centralize it a little bit more. So it is a little bit of a glitch, but we will, hopefully that'll be sorted out at some point. Now we've got a bit of an issue here. If I'm on my vignette layer and I set this to multiply, for example, or any other blend mode, nothing is going to happen, or at least that's what it's going to appear, because what's happening is our gradient is overriding this big green rectangle. So if I turn my effects off, you can see that it is actually adding a blend mode to these, and we get some really funky effects happening there, but it's not affecting because our gradient's there. So as I mentioned before, this green rectangle is just for appearances, and I'm going to go to fill, and I'm going to drop the fill for that down from 100% down to 0. So this is going to make that shape invisible, but it is not going to affect my layer styles or my effects. So if I turn those back on, they are not affected. They're only affected if I go to opacity. Now what I can do is go back into my gradient, and I'm going to set the blend mode from normal to multiply. And multiply is essentially going to hide everything that's white is going to be invisible, anything black or dark is going to be more visible. And there we have it. We can actually see through it. So I'm going to hit OK on that, and I'm just going to scrub through to the point where I actually want that vignette to be at its maximum. It's going to be roughly about the 2-second mark, where I want to be able to see everything with that vignette fully open. Now I'm going to do a few more adjustments because, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff that sort of we're not seeing with that. So I'm going to double click on the gradient here, and I'm going to go into this gradient bar, and I'm going to make a few adjustments. So what we're looking at here is how the colors go from white to black, and I actually want this to be less of a gradual thing, and I want it to be a bit shorter. So it's going to be more of a big white circle, and then at the edge it's going to quickly dip off and go to black. And as you see, if I move that, that's going to change it. It's still going to get that feathered effect. Now you can actually change this around. You could make it quite stark if you wanted to, using the central one. Now you actually need to be kind of careful in grabbing that, because if you move it all the way to the edge, you've got to be right on that little point, so you can adjust it there. That's kind of where I want it there. Now there are going to be some issues with this, just as far as scaling, but we'll worry about that later. So I'm going to go something about there and hit OK. Now if I scale this down, you can see the smallest it's going to be at about 10% is there. Now I could try and put like 1%, but it's going to come up saying it's got to be between 10 and 150. So that is the minimum that I've got for that, but we'll play around with that. So once again, I'm just going to scale that up to kind of where I want the end result. So maybe something around about there will do. Hit OK. And now I'm going to actually start putting the animation into that. So there's my vignette, do the drop down, and we're going to animate the style. So at that point, that's where I want my vignette to end. So I'm going to hit the stopwatch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrub back to where I actually want this to, maybe start appearing. So maybe around about where that spark jumps through. I'm going to go around about the 5 frame mark there. Then double click on my gradient again, and I'm going to scale that down to 10% and hit enter. Then as I scrub through, what we're hopefully going to see is it's going to start revealing all of that. Now at the moment that doesn't look all that great, so you may wish to jump in and try not to animate anywhere else besides these 2 points, but we might want to jump back in here and then maybe jump into our gradient and then play around with how that appears and then see if that improves. And that's looking a little bit better. So we're kind of just playing around with that lens popping out a little bit like so. The other thing we could potentially do as well is start playing around with the opacity of this. So if we really wanted this to be completely revealed towards the end, we could just drop the opacity down a bit. So there is a potential for that where you can animate the opacity. Remember, that is over here in the opacity block. But for now, I'm going to leave that as is. It's a little bit stark on the outsides here, but what I might want to do with that is actually get some of the particles and place them on top. So we'll have a look at doing that and then maybe just do a few final finish ups.